NBC anchor David Gura joining us now. And David, you get to be the bearer of great news. Nobody loves any reporter more than the guy who's coming on to talk to us about the markets being up, the Dow up over 900 points. These were just phase 1 results from Moderna, the first human trials of its coronavirus vaccine. But investors really like that a whole lot. Why?
Yeah, we have seen this a couple of times during the course of this pandemic, investors being excited by the prospect of there being progress made toward a vaccine. And that's what we got from Moderna today. This is a Cambridge, Massachusetts-based pharmaceutical company that's been doing a phase 1 trial in concert with the federal government. They rolled out a drug in immunization in 3 cities around the country, and the results were pretty good for that phase 1 standard. So investors are excited about that. Again, there's this relationship between the federal government and the company. The federal government working to accelerate the development of this vaccine. So we move on to phase 2, and that is showing some promise. I should say these are early days yet. The FDA giving that permission for it to go to the second stage, but we don't really have a sense of sort of how effective the drug is going to be against the virus itself. We know that it's not going to cause damage to humans. It's really a prophylactic drug that would prevent humans from getting this disease. So that phase 2 is going to be crucial. But as you say, when you look at this recession that we're in, when we look at the economic crisis and what the markets have been worried about, it really is the development of an effective therapeutic, an effective vaccine that is going to bring solace to investors, kind of final solace about all this. That's really going to be what cures the economic woes that we've been going through, Allison.
David, Fed Chair Jay Powell's comments over the weekend also helped push stocks higher today. He said the Fed isn't out of ammunition by a long shot. What else did he say about the economy and the Fed's role in our recovery that investors like today?
Yeah, this was a really fascinating interview, and I can draw kind of a through line from what we were just talking about to the chairman's remarks. He was asked point blank, could there be an economic recovery if you don't have a vaccine? And he was optimistic that in the second half of this year, there is going to be progress in restoring the economy, maybe not to where it was, but we could see the economy making progress. So that was something that certainly cheered investors. But he did make those comments that you just referred to, that a lot of people think the Fed is out of ammunition. There's very little that it can do. He sort of outlined in that interview other things that the Fed would be able to do: start new facilities, buy more securities. That could help the economy even more. Really, it's that sort of fundamental commitment that we've heard from Jay Powell before, that the Fed is willing to do all that it can do in this time of economic crisis to make sure that the economy is as fortified as it can be. The Fed's saying it'll do all it can, Allison.
David, we are off to a good start so far, but of course it is only Monday. What else are you watching out for on Wall Street and on the economy this week?
Couple of things. Square making some news this afternoon, saying it's going to allow workers who've been working from home to continue working from home in perpetuity. We saw a similar announcement last week from Twitter. Both of those companies helmed by Jack Dorsey, so perhaps not surprising that we'd see it from Square as well. But this is really another glimpse at this new normal, companies changing their attitudes toward the way that we work to allow people to work from home even more. And then some more bad news out of Uber today. Uber had said it was going to fire 3,000 employees last week. It's now saying it's going to have to let go 3,700 more employees as well. So really devastating for that company that's really been trying to right itself, to turn itself around. Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO of that company, have been making strides doing that, but this economic crisis has really affected sort of rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft. We've seen Lyft announcing some big layoffs in recent days as well. Dara Khosrowshahi in his note to employees saying, look, Uber Eats is a part of the company that's been doing well. We're ordering food inside our houses, but that's not enough to offset the losses that we've seen overall. So another hard day in Silicon Valley for one of these big unicorns, one of these big tech companies that, again, has been trying to turn itself around and become profitable in the marketplace, Allison.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.